In the summer of 2018, I wrecked my 2009 Toyota Matrix after skidding into a guardrail on an on-ramp in Fort Lauderdale. My sister, who I can confidently say is one of the greatest sisters in the world, was at the time getting ready to trade in her 2008 Toyota Matrix, and in her graciousness and my white male younger brother privilege, she chose to give me her car instead of trading it in. At this point, I had to learn how to drive stick. It was a fun experience, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to learn. From my first time stalling out on a highway in the middle of Orlando to stalling out just the other day in the middle of a parking lot, it's been a unique experience to feel one level more connected to the car I'm driving. Looking back at my relationship with motor vehicles, I completely understand why insurance rates are higher for young male identifying drivers. I've had my fair share of wrecks and tickets, and anytime my ego gets a little too inflated, all someone has to do is remind me of that bent Longwood Elementary School sign in my neighborhood, and I quickly deflate. While appearing humorous and typical of most male drivers' early experience with cars, I look back at my time driving and I see a lot of recklessness and waste. I think the idea that the pinnacle of a 16-year-old's year is getting their driver's license is maybe something we should aim to change. Maybe we place too much emphasis on driving, and part of that's because we are like a guardrail guided down that path. So today, I want to talk about where I am after these past 100,000 miles. We romanticize the car because we don't have another way of getting around that's as quick and easy, partly due to the fact that we've built our cities around the assumption that most people will own and navigate by cars. Parking lots larger than the stores they're servicing, closed off suburbs that have little direct walking or biking paths into the city, stroads where the car is king, drive-throughs where people sit idling. It's only within the past couple months that I've been able to shift my perspective from cars as necessary to navigate our neighborhood and cities towards what I see as a broader understanding of how our cities have been built contingent to the car. The line that stood out the most for me in this was, America is currently a system where the easy decision, the most convenient, and the right decision, limiting our use of personal vehicles, are not the same decision. But what if they were? Now, while this may be the ideal scenario for some, I realize that for many, it's not possible to just pick up and move somewhere with a higher walkability score, especially when you have a family to consider. So since these other videos have done a wonderful job selling urban life, I wanted to focus on how we can shift our perspective away from our cars to the extent that we're able. So if I could go back to my childhood, how would I want to re-perspectivize my relationship to transportation? In certain areas of the country, when someone turns 16, they're afforded the possibility of significantly more freedom, in large part due to the driver's license. Because of not only this newfound freedom, but the novel sensory experience of commandeering a several-ton metal machine capable of going faster than almost any animal on Earth, some teenagers, myself included, find it a wonderful time in their life. With this ability to go almost anywhere, however, can come the demand one may put on themselves to constantly be going, to experience everything now. As a role model to someone in this situation, I'd like to cultivate a sense of slowness and the deliberation that comes from that slowness. Don't just go somewhere because you can. Go somewhere with the intent to soak in that experience, including the journey. I think most would agree with the statement that even as children, we had the freedom to walk wherever we want. In a similar fashion, our ancestors of millennia past shared this same freedom. One could say it's a human right to walk. Anything beyond this, however, becomes increasingly more of a privilege. To bike means you had the privilege that someone taught you how to ride. To be driven means you have access to someone with the resources to drive. To ride a bus or the subway means you live in an area where these services are available and effective. To drive yourself means you have the privilege to have been taught and have the resources or know someone with the resources necessary to own a vehicle. I say all this, and yet even we who are able to walk should consider that a privilege. Obviously, there are emissions associated with motor transportation, which I'll explore more in a moment, but there are also sociological impacts. In our society, even at a young age, we're taught to respect cars, to look both ways. And this is because cars kill. Anyone who finds themselves in the road at the wrong time, regardless of their intersectionality, the consequences are severe. With cars, we have created a technology that comes with a serious side effect that many of us often forget, especially those of us behind the wheel. Generally, I think that there's more responsibility put in the hands of the pedestrian to respect the road than there are put in the person driving the car, at least until the person behind the wheel ends up running someone over. This goes along with my previous point, but I also want to show that driving is dangerous even for those of us behind the wheel. Every year, roughly 1.3 million people die in car accidents worldwide, which is an average of about 3,200 deaths per day. And specifically looking at the US, there were in 2019 1.11 traffic fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. Let's look at that a little bit further. If you fill the Bryant-Denny Stadium to full capacity with 100,000 average car owners in the US, then given about 10,000 miles driven per year on a car, roughly 10 of those people in that stadium will die due to traffic-related incidents in a given year. With one's windows rolled up, cruising down the road, listening to the radio turn to 62, it's easy to forget the world around you. I've also had people remark that when listening to podcasts or audiobooks while driving, they lose sense of time until suddenly they arrive. So even when we're out and about, we're still more isolated from our community than in eras past. We're more focused on our world and our track, and we easily ignore those around us. Sometimes we deliberately choose to avoid those around us. And like the best of internet commentary, it becomes very easy to yell and belittle other people when we think they can't hear us. Only feet away, but worlds apart. For this section, what I want to do is look at the impact of the 100,000 miles that I've driven, mainly looking at it from carbon dioxide emissions. 100,000 miles driven over 5 years, that's going to be 20,000 miles per year. And I'll link the resources that I use to calculate this information based on fueleconomy.gov for my specific car, the 2008 Toyota Matrix, and also given my driving habits. It comes to about 369 grams of carbon dioxide per mile driven. This comes out to about a little over 7,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide released per year. We can translate this into tons, which is generally what carbon dioxide emissions are represented in. So this would be about 7.38 metric tons, cool spelling, of carbon dioxide emitted per year. Now, I wanted to compare this to another source just to see what I would get. So this came from fueleconomy.gov. The next source that I went to, this one's not specific to my car. This would just be like average, I guess, in the US. This source is coolclimate.org. It's basically a software that you can use to calculate your entire carbon footprint online. It's developed by these two PhD guys that do climate things. You can tell how much of a climate scientist I am based on the words I'm using. Their calculation is about 7.61. So this is really just based on the amount of miles that I drive per year. So we got two different sources here, but I think it's safe to say I would probably be somewhere in like 7.5 tons. So that was the first thing I did. And what I wanted to do from there was determine how I could reduce this. The two methods that seem to produce the greatest effects on being able to reduce this, the thing that would pretty much eliminate the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that I would have per year would be getting an electric vehicle. I want to dive a little bit more into the carbon dioxide emissions associated with electric vehicles because it's not zero. Tailpipe-wise, it is. I mean, the car's not actively producing carbon dioxide as it's going down the road as compared to a gasoline car. But there's obviously the upstream emissions that are associated with getting that car recharged. Depending on where you are, if you're in a location that uses more renewable resources, that's going to be associated with less carbon dioxide emissions. Whereas a place that uses coal, more likely, like the area that I'm in, you're going to have greater levels of carbon dioxide emissions associated with getting your vehicle recharged. Again, this isn't carbon dioxide emissions from the vehicle itself, but just carbon dioxide emissions from the electricity used to recharge the vehicle. Also on fueleconomy.gov, they had a graph which I'll pull up here on the screen so that you can see it nice and pretty. It's looking like 130 grams of carbon dioxide per mile emitted on an electric vehicle that is recharged using conventional United States coal producing power plants versus the number that I gave you before based on fueleconomy.gov was the 369 grams of carbon dioxide per year. So a lower number. Now you could get a little bit more granular and take a look and see, well, what is the actual upstream emissions? Well, because electric vehicles, the only source of their carbon dioxide emissions is the upstream emissions. Again, upstream is the carbon dioxide that is produced to generate the electricity that's used to recharge the car. So the upstream emissions are going to be the 130 grams of carbon dioxide versus for producing gasoline, the refinery process, the transportation, everything associated with the upstream cost of fueling a gasoline powered car. So of this 369, the upstream emissions are going to be 63 grams of carbon dioxide per year. Did I say per year? I meant to put per mile here. This should be per mile. Hopefully those of you who are following along with the math recognize that, and so I was testing you. Good job, you passed. So the upstream cost of generating the fuel for your car, whether that fuel be electricity or that fuel is gasoline, yes, the upstream costs of an electric vehicle are higher, but this is still, it's almost 3 times the carbon dioxide emissions, and that's because of the tailpipe emissions. So yes, it is important to look at the carbon dioxide emissions associated with your fuel production, whether that be gasoline or electricity, but in this case, you're still just looking at significantly less grams of carbon dioxide emissions produced. So basically, I could reduce my carbon emissions driving by getting an electric vehicle. I don't think that comes as a surprise. Again, what I wanted to highlight here was to address some people's concerns that, well, there are still emissions associated with electric vehicles. That is absolutely true, but still a third of the emissions of at least the car that I'm using. Anyways, okay, so the second thing I could do if I didn't want to buy an electric car, or maybe not necessarily that I don't want to, but something that I can do right now before buying an electric car, are eco-driving tips. So eco-driving, there's a couple components to it. We'll look at reducing highway speeds, which I was really surprised at. Then there's also looking at the amount of AC that you use. Obviously, reducing idling, keeping your car well maintained, keeping everything running nice and smooth, replacing air filters, oil, all that kind of stuff. So these eco-driving things help to reduce the carbon emissions. We're going to go into the first one a little bit more in depth. The other 3 are, the impact of them is a little bit lower. Reducing highway speeds. So this actually goes back to looking at coolclimate.org. So this was specifically looking at someone like me who drives 20,000 miles a year, someone like me who would regularly drive at least 5 miles per hour of the speed limit. So we're talking like 75 miles per hour in a 70 speed limit zone. And honestly, that's probably a little low. I probably would average closer to 78 or 80, but we'll say 75. So based on a highway speeds of 75 miles per hour, spending about 60% of my time driving on the highway versus just on common roads, which I think is about average. I think 45% or 55% is about the average. I think I probably spend a little bit more time driving on the highway than most people because of just where I live. And then I think also that 75 being about 80% of the time that I'm on highway. Obviously, there's sometimes you're on the highway where the speed's going to be 60. So I'm not going to be driving 75 into 60. Can't say that I haven't done it before, but most of the time I won't be. Okay, so based on these assumptions, let's say I took that 75 average and brought it down to 60. According to the software on this website, that would reduce my yearly carbon emissions by 2 tons. 2 tons of carbon dioxide per year. A fifth to almost a quarter of my carbon dioxide emissions could be reduced per year by lowering my speed 10 miles per hour on the highway, which honestly is probably something that's, I could do. That's pretty easy to do. I think most of the time, the reason that I speed, and this is going back to the part one where driving is such a sociological impact on us. Most of the time that I'm speeding is because I'm wanting to get where I'm going. I'm not driving and being there and present while driving. Granted, like, I don't think we should romanticize the driving experience, overly romanticize it, I should say. But the point being that, okay, 10 miles per hour to save 2 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year, which is also going to save me money in gasoline used. I think that's something I can do. So yeah, 2 tons of carbon dioxide emissions reduced per year by reducing highway speeds based on the coolclimate.org, their software, which again gives based on their assumptions, which I feel like, other than the fact that they don't know what car I'm using, that's given them a fair amount of data. The amount of highway miles, the amount of time spent driving at that speed at highway miles, I'm fairly confident in it. And then the other things in eco driving, personally, I love driving with the window down, even at like 70 miles per hour or 80 miles per hour. But because you get such a reduction in PG, the simple tip that the New York Transportation.gov website gave was the 40 mile per hour cutoff. So at speeds 40 miles per hour or less, they recommend rolling the windows down. And then anything above that, they just recommend using the AC to avoid the drag that reduces your fuel efficiency. So that's a look at my car and where I could make improvements in my carbon dioxide emissions. It's pretty specific to me, but I thought it could just kind of be a little bit of an eye-opener for others, and you can kind of compare it based on what your typical driving habits are, or if you want to really get in depth, you can go to that coolclimate.org website, which gives you, like I said, like a pretty decent rundown of your complete carbon dioxide emissions. Do you get deja vu? I come from an area antithetical to urban living. I grew up in a single-family home that was distinctly nestled between the largest Air Force base by landmass in the U.S. and the Great Big Gulf of Mexico. I had the unique opportunity amongst most of my friends to be able to bike to elementary school, but by middle school, I was being driven at least half the length of Manhattan. What I loved about growing up where I did was that the neighborhood was isolated from the major traffic areas of the city, which meant my parents, for the most part, could trust my friends and I to explore the neighborhood on our bikes by ourselves. Of course, I still had to be driven around town to go to the movies or see my friends outside of my neighborhood, but it wasn't until many of my neighborhood friends began to move out that I increasingly spent less time in my neighborhood and more time being driven around town. So paradoxically, as I grew up, losing these neighborhood relationships also lessened my sense of freedom in the world, or at least it seemed to as I sit here 20 years later psychoanalyzing my childhood. In 2019, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Brisbane, Australia, and I quickly became enamored, not necessarily with my studies there, but with the appeal of living in the city. For the first time in 15 years, here I was with a renewed sense of independence, not from being miles away from everyone I knew, but independence cultivated by the non-necessity of driving. Brisbane has a great public bike system, and for like $2 a month, I was able to ride their bikes all around town, everywhere I needed to go. Grocery store, movie theater, park, work. It was great. I even had the freedom to get away from the city and backpack around an island for a couple of days, all with a short train ride out to the coast. I remember coming back home from Australia and getting back in my car to drive for the first time in over a month and feeling like a kid trying to fit in their parents' shoes. It felt too big and alien to me. Of course, I do bias myself toward novel experiences, so maybe it was just a reprieve from my daily driving experiences. I really do think we can benefit from separating ourselves from our cars to the extent that we're able. I personally am looking forward to moving to a more urban environment soon, but until then, I'll start using some of the tips that I mentioned earlier while still living in Cartopia. As always, I would love to hear what I'm wrong about in all this, and I truly do mean that unironically. I'd love for you to challenge me with your perspective because in the end, that's all we really have. Thank you for watching, and I hope you think of yourself less this week.